Hi YouTubers, so I've decided to make a video today just basically giving my own thoughts about the recent fear over the coronavirus, or COVID-19 I think is the now technical term that's increasingly being used to describe it. But actually that's interesting what the name is about it, because I'm going to talk about that in a minute actually, because that's quite an interesting sort of thread on the discussion of it, just because I first of all had some confusion about that because it was referred to as coronavirus, not because of the other beer or because of the Latin name, which actually means crown, but actually because there are other coronaviruses. There's a whole family of coronaviruses. So this latest one is just another strain of those other viruses that have been detected and known about for some years. I don't know how many years. Some sources that I've read claim up to 30 years, going back to the 1970s. I don't know the history of that well, but certainly going back to the 90s and the millennium, there's been various other strains of similar kinds of corona-type viruses. So they come from the same kind of family of viruses, actually. And that's why you see other references to corona in other books, in literature, and I think there's that now infamous episode of The Simpsons that lots of people refer to, where there's something that says the coronavirus on that. And a lot of people have then said as a result of that, oh, how did they know all those years ago about this coronavirus? Well, because it had been studied and researched that there are this family of various viruses coming under the umbrella term of corona. So that's why. It probably wasn't a type of virus at the time that was so well known. It certainly didn't have the publicity to the extent that other viruses did, particularly like TB or HIV, conditions that are much more widespread and therefore much more known about. You know, there are undoubtedly many strains of viruses that are probably much less known about and less studied, and so there will be typically much less publicity about it. You know, I don't know how many, there could be hundreds or thousands, who knows. But there are, you know, and if you go back years, decades and centuries, there will be large numbers, of course. So it stands to reason that we're only going to have an increased awareness about things that happen to have an increased exposure, where there's much more people with it today in the modern sense, and where that affects much more people. That just seems a reasonable thing. So it seems to me that there was some, but a lesser awareness that there were corona-type viruses, similar strains, that is. To start off with, though, really, my own thoughts when all this first came about just a few weeks ago, I think it was now, was that I was just totally shocked and at the overreaction as I felt it was, and I still feel it is now actually, and how and why I felt it was just such an overreaction is just the fact that the case numbers that have been talked about and are being talked about still, in terms of what those numbers are and the mortality rates, it's comparable to things like influenza. Now, there's a huge discussion, and there are so many different sources claiming so many different things about this, in fact. So it's quite hard to know. But I suppose to keep things brief to the most important bits of information, as I can see it, is that we don't know absolutely accurate records. Now, some doctors that I've read sources on are saying that it's really hard to isolate that specific strain of corona, COVID-19 as it's referred to, rather than there being another kind of similar strain of corona. So we're not sure how accurate the testing is. I'm not, at least. I'm not medically trained, and I haven't read accurate reports to corroborate that yet either. And I will update that if I know anything more about it. So I don't know whether the positive tests for corona are just for that particular strain, what's referred to as COVID-19, or whether that's potentially also confirming other strains that could be in people's bodies for corona, for various other corona strains, and there are many others. Now, there are other problems with getting accurate records of how many people have it. And I'm just going to come on to discuss those points briefly. I'll try to be concise because there's quite a few. So the one, we talked about that one point, are we sure whether it's that particular strain of that particular corona, or that it could be some other strains of coronas? And an additional point connected to that is, those other strains of corona, do they show up in tests even after one's gotten over it? So if I had a corona type virus many years ago, could I still test positive for that now? And in which case, if that was the case, millions of people could have had these past viruses and could therefore be testing positive for those things. I'm not saying that's the case, I just don't know enough about that. And I think as the general public, we probably mostly aren't clued up and we don't know enough medical history about those particular things. It would need a virologist or an expert in that field who'd taken the time, the energy to actually study that themselves. But I just say that as a sort of an area of interest that we lack knowledge on, and I think we should all do research to find out more about, actually, before we go off quoting wild figures. The second key point to me is that many people that are reportedly dying of this condition, the COVID-19, have a lot of pre-existing other health conditions. So we're not sure whether those other health conditions that they died of, it could be that they have emphysema or COPD that make them more vulnerable to other viruses. It could be that virus is a secondary infection, it's often the case, or that they have cancer, or so it's quite hard to position what actually has killed people. Sometimes if someone's quite ill with chronic conditions, it may be that they would have passed away anyway and that they happen to have a viral strain as well as the other thing that killed them. Or it could be a combination of things that kills someone and overwhelms them. Or it could be quite likely that we are not able to ascertain when some people die what it is that actually killed them, if and especially when they've got a number of different conditions. And then actually, on a personal note, that was actually the case with my mother recently. She passed away about a month ago now. It might be longer, but she actually had COPD. She had an undiagnosed long-term infection she'd had for about 9 months or so, and then we suspect a secondary infection, but we're not sure what type. And she also had lymphedema as well. When she passed away, the assessment of the doctors simply wrote on the death certificate for her pneumonia. Pneumonia is reported to kill between 2 to 3 million people per year, in fact. And in terms of 60 million people dying per year, there's quite a high proportion of those attributed to pneumonia, actually, if you consider that. But there's a lot of other infectious diseases too. But the point I was making is that what we're not always able to ascertain is that actually what the cause of death always is. And that's a common problem for a lot of pathologists anyway. When people are very old, when they have a number of different conditions, sometimes secondary infections, and often long-term conditions, that affect various parts of the body, we're not sure if it was one particular condition, a number of them, or perhaps even all of them. So it's often a problem more generally, actually describing what it is that killed someone anyway. And if you look at Italy, for example, that's quite interesting because they are reporting a high number of deaths due to COVID-19, but actually they have got one of the oldest populations in the world, and people that are very elderly are much more susceptible to long-term chronic conditions like cancers, for example, like arthritis, like heart disease and cardiovascular disorders that account for large numbers of death anyway, and like a number of other viral strains, particularly like pneumonia we've talked about. So it could be that many people being diagnosed with that actually had a number of other conditions and disorders that either contributed to the deaths or could have actually been the cause of it rather than the COVID-19 strain. So it's quite hard to distinguish oftentimes the cause of actual death. So I talked about in the first point, distinguishing between COVID-19 and the other coronaviruses, the other strains. But actually the third point now I want to come on to is distinguishing between this and actually the more general viral infections of things like influenza or pneumonia. Where people pass on and there's no test done, it can be quite hard to know whether it's one thing or the other. How would we know? And of course, many people might pass on without there being an autopsy or pathologist's report or a doctor's examination. So it may be oftentimes in cases where there's been no kind of tests done, and we just simply won't know the actual figures. So it's kind of hard to know that, really. How do we know, even if, and those three problems already in ascertaining what the true extent of the figures are, and the fourth figure you can say to that is underreported. One, minor cases will not go reported. That means that therefore we will get a lesser number potentially reported, but also that the mortality rate will be exaggerated because of that, because minor cases that go underreported. And, you know, I'm not going to report to anyone if I have a case of the cold or flu normally, if I get over it, unless I want a doctor's sick note or something. I'm just going to take a few weeks off work or struggle carrying on working. And then after a few weeks when it's passed, you know, I'm not going to talk about it much, so and move on. So potentially hundreds of thousands of cases of ordinary flu anyway would go ordinarily underreported. And that's quite normal, as you'd expect. And that could equally be true for any other corona strain or the COVID-19. So that could then imply that there could be a lot more potential cases, but that the mortality rate could be much lower. And interesting on the mortality rate, I think there was a case where there were some people stranded on a ship, on a cruise liner, and all of them tested positive, I think, if we believe the reports of that. And they had a very low mortality rate in actual fact, even when you take into consideration that the majority of those people on that particular ship, they were all quite elderly in fact, and many of them understandably therefore had pre-existing conditions that made them more susceptible anyway. So I think there are those 4 now reasons of why we can't be too sure of the figures, even when people are making extraordinary efforts to be honest and as much as they can be with stretched and limited resources. And even under those conditions, there are still potential a lot of problems with actually having and relying on accurate reports. So at best, when we look at numbers, people are quoting them like they're gospel or like they're infallible sometimes, and that's just ridiculous when you actually take into consideration how difficult it actually is to get accurate recordings of figures on any kind of infectious diseases and what is actually the cause of generally in any deaths. Even with the best will in the world and where there are good intentions, those figures can be at best very rough estimates, but sometimes woefully inaccurate in other cases. I'll just give you a point of example. Somebody might have TB and AIDS, for example. They might then later contract another viral infection. They might die of that. What do you put down on the death certificate? Do you put that down as TB? Do you put that down as AIDS? Do you put that down as something else could have caused it, potentially? So there are so many cases. What we are making assumptions of too often is in knowledge that we all have absolute knowledge. We tend to think that sometimes of doctors too much, that they can be infallible, but we can all make mistakes when making a diagnosis. And especially when someone has died, we're not always sure. And there are so many cases where there's so much uncertainty about that. I just think that at the moment, like when it first came out, I felt that it was a real overreaction, just based on the fact that the actual numbers are quite small in comparison to the overall number of deaths due to infectious diseases per year anyway. They sound like incredible numbers and like terrifying when you think about thousands that have died of it, you know, hundreds of thousands may have it. But when you actually think about it, millions die of infectious diseases each year, hundreds of millions people have it and get over it though. So actually in a bigger situation, when you look at the broader context, you know, are we exaggerating and are we worrying about that situation too much? Absolutely. And I couldn't see any other way to look at it because I was aware of the wider context and the situation. I think due to my background, because I'd worked in home care, I worked around people with terminal illnesses, with people that have got long-term illnesses, I've worked with people that have had various viral conditions, and actually trying to help people with those conditions as well. I spent a lot of time, many hours, doing a lot of research into these conditions as well. So for me, when I was hearing people quoting information and statistics, I'm no expert on the field, but at the same time, I wasn't someone who absolutely knew nothing about it. I spent 18 months working in home care. I spent about 7 or 8 years visiting somebody regularly at a care home every single week, who had chronic illnesses and who went through a series of viral trials, picking up a number of different infections. So, and when you're caring for someone, you do a lot of research, don't you, into trying to find out what possible treatments there are. Like I've also had it myself. So I'm certainly not an expert. I'm not any more qualified than many other people. But at the same time, the amount of information that I knew was enough for me to know that we are kind of worrying and overreacting and exaggerating things well out of proportion to such an extent it would almost be laughable were it not for the situation. Now, I'm not going to say I'm not laughing about it, and I won't, because I do understand why a lot of people are taking it seriously, and I quite understand that myself. I take flu seriously, influenza. I've taken that seriously for years, not as much as I should have. I tried not to visit people or limit visiting people very sick with it. And those procedures and precautions should have been placed. If you haven't been doing those things for many, many years, why not? Did you not know that millions of people are dying each year of these diseases anyway? So I think it's taking reasonable and proportions. But I think the idea of shutting down all businesses, restaurants, pubs, I think that's just a woeful exaggeration. But at the same time, what can ordinary people do about that if that is something that is government-led and legislated and beyond our power, and that's something top-down that other people have decided, and so that's beyond our control, isn't it? We have to comply with things. I can't keep going. I've lost my job through that. I was working as a kitchen porter in a restaurant. Like all the other restaurants, they've had to comply and had to close down, really. It's just a ridiculous over-exaggeration and overreaction. And either those people are sort of driven by panic or they want to create panic. And I don't know what their motive is. I'm not here to judge them because I don't know what their true intentions are in any of this. But I do know it is a ridiculous overreaction to it all. That's my conclusions based on the statistics of the wider situation and the wider context that is the overall number of deaths. 60 to 70 million people will die roughly each year, and just to cheer you up a little bit more than that though, slightly more than that will be born each year, although born into a world of suffering, but in a world of joy and love and happiness and all the other things that come with suffering too. But 60 million people, 60 to 70 roughly, again, those are wildly rough figures. How do we really know? Who keeps accurate death records in poorer countries? Who even knows in wealthy countries? My own father's a missing person and has been for years, and I don't know if he's alive or dead. And sadly, that's the case for hundreds of thousands, perhaps even millions of people globally. And certainly in poorer countries where there are less access to records, we won't really know the true extent of the death figures. But roughly 60 to 70 million people will die each year. And of those, many millions will be due to illnesses. And this alleged COVID-19 makes up a very, very tiny fraction of that. It accounts to less than 1%, in fact, of the overall number of deaths. Very tiny. So if you're going to react and worry and come up with all these kind of schemes to come up with how to save lives, why don't you do that for car deaths? Why don't you do that for pneumonia? Why don't you do that for cancers, for AIDS, for TB? Why don't you do that for a countless number of other things that cause hundreds of thousands and millions of deaths each year, every year, and have done for decades? That's the wider context that I'm talking about. So I base it within that, the realm of statistics, however unreliable they can still be. I still think some rough estimates are better than none. But as long as we do phrase it that they're not totally infallible, and we say, okay, we're not too sure, we're not going to stake our life on it, we're not going to sort of gamble everything on it, but if we're going to base anything on reasoned arguments, we're going to at least attempt to be as credible as we can and look and search at different resources for where those accurate figures are. And I think that's the best method, is to try and look at as many different resources and try and compare those and look for sort of a reliable consensus if there is one that can be found. So I suppose how I'm sort of going to try and do things is basically carrying on as much as normal as I can, really, but taking on as, I suppose, reminding myself to take precautions. I'm not going to go out and slobber over strangers, or because I wouldn't have done that anyway, in fact, because there already have been risks of transmission through passing on fluids or blood, or any bodily fluids, like mucus especially, is a great way to sort of transmit viral infections and that. So we already should have been washing our hands, especially after food, after toileting, but especially when meeting strangers, and especially if they have other weakened immune systems and other conditions that make them vulnerable. We already should have been doing these things for months and years anyway. And if you have only just woken up and decided to take these precautions recently, why on earth haven't you been doing these things over the last few years anyway? I mean, I've been carrying around a hand wash and toilet and tissue paper for the last year or two, but that's specifically because I have had an increased risk of having viral infections, because I visit a care home every week anyway. So those people that have worked in home care or have worked in hospitals or care homes, they're already quite aware of those risks anyway to people with compromised immune systems. So they already had been taking those precautions for many years anyway. But they didn't go out and say, let's close down all restaurants and not allow people in reasonable health to meet up and go to sports venues or pubs. They didn't sort of take draconian measures that are sort of so wildly disproportionate. But nevertheless, we have to comply with legislation that is there already existing. And I'm going to take that as a positive thing and try to make the best of it, as of course we all must. I'm going to take some time out, see it as a good opportunity to take time out, clean the house, have a good spring clean, catch up on reading, writing, studying, watching interesting documentaries, making interesting videos, meeting up with people you haven't seen for a while, writing lots of letters perhaps, doing art projects, going for walks in the park, looking at nature, doing other things that you might be interested in, other hobbies and pursuits. It's a good opportunity for that, isn't it? And we've still got the telephone, the internet and other ways of communicating people. I'm not going to go and hug a stranger, because I'm going to respect their rights. If they have got those fears of picking up infections from others, I respect their rights not to want to be too close to others, and that's fine. And I totally accept that other people will come to different conclusions for that. And if some people believe that those measures are not extreme and it's acceptable and realistic for them, I can understand people come to different conclusions even when we may have looked at similar evidences. And I respect people's right to have those views, even if I do disagree with them. But I'm not going to go and hug strangers or invade their personal space. Far from it. I never did that before anyway. I respect their rights to have their own safe space and their own boundary and time alone for however long that might be. My goal is to go back into to continue working, having lost my job through this, and I'm looking at a variety of roles to carry on with and to do other things now, but to continue other interests as well. But I think to sort of look at it in a lot more long-term thing, because I want to go on to talk about that now. I suppose my thoughts on that are that I don't know. I've got quite a number of thoughts. I don't want to censor my thoughts. I want to speak freely, really. I don't want to sort of be driven by fear or anything. I kind of feel like this thing, it could be, because of the number of reasons I've said, it could be that we don't really know the true rate of it. So I'm taking all of the statistics that I'm being given as sort of like, yes, it might be true, it might not be. I'm not sure. It's certainly not infallible. But what I'm thinking about it is that we don't really know. Some people could be driven to want to spread fear. I don't know. There certainly are people like that in life. That's my experience. Many and majority of people are not like that. But I know we all can be led by fear sometimes, especially in situations where it's new, we don't understand it, we're concerned about something that is unknown to us and that we haven't done research on and we're uncertain about. So what I kind of think with this is this whole situation could clear up, and we could see that there are less numbers reported. I don't trust necessarily the numbers being reported anyway, but the numbers could clear up, and then people, the government or officials might say, okay, well, that proves that the social isolation and all the extreme measures worked. But it doesn't necessarily prove that cause and effect. It could be, like with other infections, that the rate could have gradually decreased anyway. So we're not necessarily certain that those measures would be what caused it anyway. And that is important because that could then be used as a pretext to do this again. It could be said next year, for example, there's another viral strain. Let's close down everything and let's do it all again. This could become, therefore, if a precedent is set, a yearly event. We could be doing this every year for the rest of our lives. The other fear, of course, could be that what if, like influenza, this other strain of corona or whatever it's called, COVID-19, what if it doesn't clear up, and what if it actually becomes, like influenza, something that just remains? And it doesn't necessarily gradually keep growing up to the extent where it kills everyone. It may, this year, I'm just giving made up figures now, it could kill this year, 400,000, next year 800,000, the next year 1.1 million, 1.4 million, 1.8 million, just made up figures. But, pneumonia killed 3 million people in the last year, estimated figures say. So what if it becomes another infectious disease like that? Does that mean that if the figures gradually keep getting worse, but they never get quite as bad as pneumonia, for example, does that mean the draconian measures will never be lifted? The pubs will never open, the restaurants will never open, many jobs will, small businesses will remain closed forever then? Or when would those things be lifted? Like, it could, that's a possibility. If it becomes another kind of influenza strain, let's look at it like TB, for example. It could continue growing, and if it grows at a certain rate each year, okay, it could be a risk to people with severely compromised immune systems. But a good reaction to that would be protect those people, keep those people limited in the extent to which they see people, so that they're only seeing a few people at home, that their shopping and basic medications and needs are dropped off to them. But the majority of the population who don't have a strong risk to that, what would be the point of limiting their risk to stop them getting influenza, which already kills 3 million people? So I suppose the fear of this is either that all these measures could be stopped at some point, but they could later be reinstated at any other time, or that it could simply remain, and this is now the new status quo. I'm not that bothered about going out to restaurants and pubs anyway. I never had that much money, and I don't go out to socialise there often anyway. So, but I do think it would be a shame not to go out and not to have any more festivals or fetes or parties or gatherings of any kind ever again. And before you stop and say that couldn't happen, when you look at the rates of other infectious diseases, that there are many that do gradually, they gradually continue going up like that, if you can imagine a steady line like that, and that is the rate of population is like that. It's a sort of a larger angle. So the rate of infection, if it was like that, the same, it would kill everyone, we'd all die. The rate of pneumonia, for example, is much less. It's not a flat line, unfortunately, but it's slightly up. It's not like that, but it's slightly up. What if it remains like a pneumonia, for example? Does that mean that we just remain like that, stagnated, a completely crushed economy, people, hundreds of millions of people without any work, poverty blooming, anxiety, depression. More people will probably die from suicides, I would imagine, and from severe isolation and depression if you continued those measures in the long term. Hopefully, it wouldn't come to that. But that is a sort of a question that we haven't considered. And I think it's reasonable to ask questions like that, like what would happen if it just continued gradually increasing, not sudden and dramatic increases, but just slow, gradual increases over long periods of time, like happens with influenza and a number of other infectious diseases. What then happens to all these so-called emergency measures put in place? Are they then lifted at some later point in the realization that actually mainstream society doesn't need such extreme measures to protect itself, that actually the risks are, whilst the risks are there, they're relatively low, and that actually the risks of completely stopping everything in society are much higher in terms of the risks to social stagnation, isolation. Did you know that millions of people, several millions of people die of suicide each year? Suicide is a really big killer. Mental health is an extraordinarily big thing. Potentially, therefore, it might not be unreasonable to think more people might end up dying of suicide than actually die of this alleged So before we start panicking about this this COVID-19, or this one strain of the corona rather, why don't you worry about the other things just as much? Suicide, the murder rates. 1 million people died of car crashes last year. Hundreds of millions, tens of millions had serious injuries from car crashes. Hundreds of millions, very minor injuries. Why aren't we as concerned about those deaths? Aren't their deaths just as worthy? Didn't the people that loved them, weren't their hearts broken too? Whether they died of pneumonia or TB or AIDS or car crashes or murders or suicides, or a long list of other numerous things besides. Weren't their deaths just as tragic? Weren't their families just as heartbroken? Shouldn't we make every effort, therefore, to prevent those things too? And in terms of the infectious diseases, all the more so to say, well, if you are going to say we're going to stop people meeting in groups simply to stop the spread of a strain that is killing a tiny, tiny amount of people compared to the ordinary influenza, compared to pneumonia, which kills far greater numbers. So either we are grossly underreacting to pneumonia, or we are totally overreacting to this latest thing. So I kind of worry that, I shouldn't worry about the worry, but the actual panic over this could end up causing more deaths than the actual alleged virus itself. I suppose that's the concern. Panic and worry doesn't itself help anything. Keeping calm and trying to deal with things in a rational, practical manner, that's what nurses, home carers are used to having to deal with anyway. And actually, there's another knock-on side effect that's quite concerning.